Well, welcome to New College Franklin and our Collegium lecture tonight. I'm Nathan Johnson, one of the professors here at New College. We're so happy to have you, students, parents, friends, community members. If you don't know much about New College, we are a 4-year Christian classical liberal arts college. Our students study one degree, a liberal arts degree, where they read and discuss the great texts of the Western tradition in theology, philosophy, literature, the trivium, the quadrivium, the 7 great liberal arts. And they do all of this for the purpose of being discipled in wisdom, virtue, and service. If you want to know more about New College Franklin, we have a table in the back. It has brochures. You can also sign up for our newsletter. You can get some swag, both free swag and purchased swag. So please check out the table in the back. We're so happy to have you. Let me tell you about the format for the evening real quick. So Dr. Johnson will be giving our lecture tonight on James Clerk Maxwell. After that, Mr. Lubin, a teaching fellow at New College, and I will come up and do a panel discussion with Dr. Johnson, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. It'll go about an hour and a half. But you're going to be aching for more. So there will be more. Downstairs, the after party, where there will be refreshments and refreshing conversation, where you can talk to each other, talk to Dr. Johnson late into the evening, but not too late. Some of the students have bedtime. So without further ado, let me tell you about tonight. So Dr. Johnson will be speaking on James Clerk Maxwell, Presbyterian elder, trained classicist, greater than Newton. Which is more shocking of those 3? We will find out tonight. Dr. Johnson is a first-year teaching fellow at New College, specializing in the quadrivium. He has a PhD in energy, environment, and mechanical engineering from Washington University. And he is also an avid student of the classical liberal arts, which is hard to find. An engineer who is also a student of the classical liberal arts, and one of his kind of vocational aims is to bring those 2 things together, and I think you'll see that come out a little bit tonight. So join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson.
Good evening, welcome, thank you for coming out. Albert Einstein was once asked, "Do you stand on the shoulders of Newton?" To which he responded, "No, it is on Maxwell's shoulders that I stand." And yet, in the popular culture, though, Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein are household names, synonymous with a genius, outside of a subset of physicists and electrical engineers that use some equations, Maxwell is not really known on a popular level at all. And even those that do study his works perhaps know less about the man biographically than do the others, as mentioned. I hope to remedy that tonight. As we'll explore the life and thought of Maxwell, we'll see a great scientist, but also a good man in many capacities. So, James Clerk Maxwell, born 1831, Edinburgh, Scotland, son of a man who was born as John Clerk. His father was a lawyer, and he inherited the Maxwell estate of Glenlair. So Maxwell is actually an appended name. So Clerk Maxwell is a sort of double name. We'll just say Maxwell to prevent the confusion. So James was the only son of John and his mother. And after the inheritance occurred not long after James was born, and so there was much of country living in James's young life. In fact, James, if you will, was homeschooled. We find that in his early life, while his father would commute back and forth between Edinburgh and Glenlair, that he was taught by his mother, although in a very unstructured environment. Lots of outside play in the field, in the trees, in the pond. He got to hang out with his beloved dogs, stargazing and music. There's a nice woodcut of a hosted dance when James was a young boy, and James has no interest in the people dancing, but is mesmerized by the violin and caught in a glimmering stare at the instrument. His mother taught him, the biographer Lewis Campbell tells us, to look through nature to nature's God. And there was a strong emphasis on knowledge of Scripture and Christian piety. So James had memorized the 119th Psalm by age 8. A great achievement by his teacher, his mother, though sadly she was to pass when he was of that age, at age 47, of what we think is an abdominal cancer. So Maxwell's father then, he's still practicing law, and there's a question of what to do with the boy's learning. After an initial failed attempt of hiring a private tutor, he was sent off to Edinburgh Academy, a classical school. So we now have a homeschooler entering a brick-and-mortar classical school. And we find a lot of what, at least in the renewing classical ed movement, we see from letters that we have. So a note about his time. So his father would continue the travel back and forth between Edinburgh and Glenlair, and James would live with his Aunt Kay, the sister of his deceased mother, and the father would come and visit, and then James would also go home. So the Scottish academic year is from November to April. Lots of time back home. But in the meantime, there were letters, so we know a lot of what James read and thought about what he read and learned from the letters to father. We see indications, so this is the biographer speaking, that there was a lot of rote learning early on. So if there's any classical teacher out there and just wanting further motivation to push rigor, the young boys, this was a boys' school, had at middle school age had learned about 800 irregular Greek verbs, plus all the regular things. You can think drill and kill, rote learning, swatting of the knuckles, all the fun things. Maxwell didn't take to this. He had revolted on his tutor early on because of such methods. He was of a creative mind, and like so many of those that are creative and full of imagination, monotony was a bane to him, and he actually did not do well early on in arithmetic or Latin, though he did perform well at scripture memory, an interesting course added to the curriculum. So his letters at the time indicate references to, and I should mention, when the translation comes, he's much happier and it starts to excel. So translation from Ovid, Aeneas, mentions of Aeneas, Neptune, translation of Virgil, Horace, reading of Milton. He had a very strong Scottish accent. English wasn't quite a second language to him, but he still had to take English nonetheless and excelled in that. Moving from the rote learning to translation, where he began to explore, think at a higher level, he really did showcase his ability. His father took a very great interest into his education. The biographer notes that his father at times almost acted like an elder brother because of the constant inquiries made and the excitement to which his father would show towards James as James learned things. When Father John would visit Edinburgh, he took, especially as James was older, around 14, he started to take him to science exhibitions and to meetings of the Royal Society, of which his father was a member. And in fact, James early on, he showcased his creativeness because he generated a new method for creating ovals with a pencil and string. And for his age, it was a remarkable feat. He had triumphed even over Descartes in his method, noted for creating ovals. Before Maxwell even had explored Euclid, he also, and we don't know how he came about this, but he created the Platonic solids. So he writes, I've created a tetrahedron, an icosahedron, and 3 other hedrons out of some cardboard. He loved play. He continued to play. In fact, we find odd stories of him. The boys at school, he seemed to not engage in games much, except for marbles, would often go about in the trees. He was a bit of an odd bird, but he was loved because he was very kind and found friends at Edinburgh Academy. An interesting note is that someone in the administration decided that they should keep with the times of this classical school. And so they said, we should teach some modern science. And so they just grabbed one of the faculty members. You know some science. Teach the kids this textbook. These things happen sometimes. James and his friend Peter Guthrie Tate knew more than the teacher did about the sciences. Perhaps through the meetings at the Royal Society, and also through his own learning. So at the age of 16, he enters the University of Edinburgh with a focus on logic, mathematics, and natural philosophy. There are references in his letters to this time to conics, differential and integral calculus, the physicist and mathematician Poisson from France. Although he read on his own primary sources of scientists, and then continued the classical learning both from coursework and also out of his own will. So more references to Xenophon. He read some in French, so the authors not listed. Euripides, Descartes, Leibniz, Hobbes in moral philosophy, since Hobbes' moral theory is one of. He read Kant's Pure Critique in German. Maxwell had quite an aptitude for language. So you see a lot of some of the great books that he was engaged with, great authors, great scientists, and he continued to push himself and to read well. Here's one amusing note that, so for those of you students that may suffer, as I do, from the temptation when waking up to check the phone, look at notifications, see if the world's still there, Maxwell does not advocate for such a practice. He prescribes translation early. I find that after breakfast is the best time for reading Greek and Latin, because if I read newspapers or any of those things, then it is dissipation and ruin. And if I begin with props, he says props. No, say props. Props. This is like an insider word. Props. Props. If I begin, though, with props experiments or calculations, then I would be continually returning to them. So we see a devotion to the classical languages, his classical references throughout his life and letters as an adult that he wrote. But his love for science and mathematics already came through, because he found that if he started with them, he just wouldn't stop. Another interesting note at the time, he says that moral philosophy differs from natural philosophy in this, that the more new things we hear of in natural philosophy, the better. But in moral philosophy, the old things are the best. So that a common objection to moral philosophy is that everyone knows it before already. There's a strong conservative bent to some of Maxwell's thinking, as we'll find later in the talk. So there's a note that his thought was imaginative but unstructured, in need of training. One of the first papers he wrote as a college student was poor, genius, but poorly written. And he had a similar approach to mathematics, and this will come up here at his next stop. So he entered the University of Cambridge, age 19. He found that mathematics was a bit easy, so he just worked harder problems. He also, though there is a note that he, for all of his love of mathematics, tired of Euclid. He said, cramming 4 hours of Euclid is worse than cramming for 2-3 hours of papers. But he continued his habit of reading the great scientists, reading the classics. There is a letter that we have from one of the dons of Cambridge that, amidst other things, he gave an apology for missing Saturday chapel. Perhaps that's an idea we get. Saturday chapel? Yes? Okay. And the reason why he missed Saturday chapel was because he was up late Friday evening reading. He read so late that he couldn't make it to prayer in the morning, and perhaps he got some chiding. We, again, continue to see his piety, so letters to home, I believe so he is of the Presbyterian background, I believe with the Westminster Divines and their predecessors ad infinitum, that man's chief end is to, this is a test, man's chief end is to God. Amen. And again in another letter, you may fly to the ends of the world and find no God but the author of our salvation. Under the high pressure, he would play games with friends. He loved to play with optical prisms, polarization of light, and magnets. But he also took to poetry. That's another mark we have. Some of his poetry is playful, amusing, some of it downright silly. But he often took to express his thoughts in that. And it's during this time that he wrote a student's evening hymn. And so if you will, because of how frequent poetry shows up in his personal letters, I wanted you to have a feel for his thought and then how he framed it. Student's evening hymn. Now no more the slanting rays with the mountain summits dally. Now no more in crimson blaze evening's fleecy cloudlets rally. Soon shall night from off the valley sweep that bright yet earthly haze, and the stars most musically move in endless rounds of praise. While the world is growing dim and the sun is slow descending past the far horizon's rim, earth's low sky to heaven extending, let my feeble earth notes blending with songs of cherubim through the same expanse ascending, thus renew my evening hymn. Thou that fillst our waiting eyes with the food of contemplation, setting in thy darkened skies signs of infinite creation. Grant to nightly meditation what a toilsome day denies. Teach me in this earthly station heavenly truth to realize. Give me wisdom so to use these brief hours of thoughtful leisure, that I may no instant lose in mere meditative pleasure. But with strictest justice measure all the ends my life pursues, lies to crush and truths to treasure, wrong to shun and right to choose. Then when unexpected sleep o'er my long-closed eyelids stealing opens up that lower deep where existence has no feeling, may sweet calm my languor healing, lend me strength at dawn to reap all that shadows world concealing, for a bold inquirer keep. Through the creatures thou hast made, show the brightness of thy glory. Be eternal truth displayed in their substance transitory, till green earth and ocean hoary, massy rock and tender blade, tell the same unending story. We are truth in form arrayed. When to study I retire, and from books of ancient sages glean fresh sparks of buried fire, lurking in their ample pages, while the task my mind engages, let the old world's new truths inspire, truths that to all after ages prompt the thought that never tires. Yet if, led by shadows fair, I have uttered words of folly, let the kind absorbing air stifle every sound unholy. So when saints with angels lowly join in heaven's unceasing prayer, mine as certainly though slowly may ascend and mingle there. Teach me so thy works to read, that my faith, new strength accruing, may from world to world proceed, wisdom's fruitful search pursuing. Till thy truth my mind imbuing, I proclaim the eternal creed, oft the glorious theme renewing, God our Lord is God indeed. Give me love aright to trace, thine to everything created, preaching to a ransom race, by thy mercy renovated, till with all thy fullness sated, I behold thee face to face, and with ardor unabated, sing the glories of thy grace. If there was a thought that Maxwell was a Christian in Victorian Britain, because everyone was a Christian in Victorian Britain, I hope that you were convinced otherwise. It was a deep faith and a tether to him all his life. One of the points of stress to which he might have taken to poetry and playing with magnets is the Tripos exam, a very famous mathematics exam held at the University of Cambridge. I think a significant amount of the students, if not all, had to take it at the time, and there was a generic passing line. For those that passed, there was a ranking system: senior wrangler, second wrangler, a few other wranglers. Those that achieved this title would be of immediate notoriety for future academic work and could almost have their lot in an occupation in certain fields. Maxwell took, so it's a 7-day exam, multiple hours a day, 4 to 6 hours, lots of geometry, lots and lots of geometry. Second wrangler, and then he also was able to then sit for a contest among the wranglers, and was the co-winner of the Smith Prize. So Maxwell then became an immediate person of note intellectually, and this allowed him to win a fellowship. So he continued on at Cambridge for a few years. And from here, in this point of the talk, we'll give a brief biography of all the places that he went, with a few notes of what he did at each stop, and then we'll step back and reflect on the scientific ideas themselves, and perhaps then what he thought about them. So he spent a few years at Cambridge, and during this time, he showed something about the colors. So Isaac Newton, there's a lot of parallels with Isaac Newton in the ways in which Maxwell transcended Newton, hence the title. So perhaps you've seen a famous image of Isaac Newton playing with a prism, an optical prism, scattering the white light into many colors. So we had known about the refraction of light through many other scientists for a time, and some had even postulated a wave theory of light. But interestingly enough, no one had been able to piece together the basic primary colors. And in short, Maxwell is the one that is responsible for our RGB theory. So you may have painted with red, blue, and yellow, but it is red, blue, and green that are the additive colors, and we thank Maxwell for that. He also made some initial contributions to electricity and magnetism. So that, for which he is most famous, it actually comes in 3 different phases. Because of his burgeoning notoriety, he was able to find a faculty position at Marshall College in Aberdeen. So his father was getting older, wanting to go back to Scotland, and sadly his father actually passed just before he was able to relocate. So he joins the faculty at Marshall College, begins to teach, tries to do research, teaching load, probably 15 hours in the classroom, which, for those that don't know, when a teacher teaches 15 hours, we don't work for 15 hours. Multiply that by 3 or 4. He still found time to do research and also to lecture to working men. So part of Maxwell's, one of the social aspects of Maxwell's Christian life is that he willingly would teach evening lectures gratis for working men to translate science into those practicing technology at a technician's level. Very busy early on, but he was alone in life. He would find, happily enough, a Catherine Dewar, who happened to be the college president's daughter, married her. They seem to have had a good marriage. They read scripture together every morning. In the brief seasons they were apart, we find further scripture exposition and letters to his wife, though their union produced no children, sadly. Catherine would take a role in some of Maxwell's experiments, which we may mention later. While here, amidst all of that, Maxwell took up his hand at astronomy. So another open question at the time was, what was the composition of Saturn's rings? We see through a telescope that there's some rings. Initially, they looked possibly like horns. I don't think Galileo quite got to see them in their glory, but now that they were rings, but them being far apart and humans not yet putting things into space, they had no idea what it was made of. Is it a solid? Is it a liquid? Is it composed of a series of satellites? And no one had even given a solid attempt at showing what they were. And Maxwell did it. He entered, it's called the Adams Prize. He placed an entry, demonstrated it, showed it. Now he's probably of national note in terms of his scientific ability. However, despite all of this, he found some of the hardships of the academic life. So there were 5 colleges, royal patronized colleges in Scotland. 2 of them were in Aberdeen, and this just wasn't fair to the folks in Edinburgh and Glasgow. So Marshall College and King's College merged, and went from 2 professors of natural philosophy to 1, and the other faculty member being older, having been tenured enough to have received a pension if they were let go, and also Maxwell being more of an intellectual and less of a negotiator. Maxwell found himself without a job after the union. So he's jobless, but not for long. This is one of the benefits of having talent and having the achievements that he had, is that he was quickly swept up by King's College London, so now a second trek down into England. I should note, there's one bit about Maxwell's teaching that I found endearing. Hopefully I've overcome this. So Maxwell, as he was teaching, this might have played into that story. He was well liked by his students. He was very kind. He was a good mentor. He even went so far as to lend out books to students, because there was a cap. The students could only have 2 books from the library. Faculty members had no limit, and they could even loan to their friends. So Maxwell just rented books for his students and said, "My students are my friends." Perhaps he had a better relationship with the students than with the librarian. He was well liked. But he had a few issues with his teaching. He prepared good notes. He did his best to teach, but apparently he would get part of the way through his teaching, get so overly excited and enraptured by his topic that he would just start spitting out analogies, sometimes conflicting. Because if you give a student multiple conflicting analogies, they'll get it. One of them will stick, right? And it left the students completely mystified. This super genius, and so I have a sympathy for Maxwell. That might have played a hand into what happened at Aberdeen. But in his next stop, King's College London, there's no complaints of his teaching, so he seemed to have remedied whatever issue there was. It's more of a modern university, more focused on something that was becoming like STEM at the time. So teaching physics, this is where he did work in what's we now call the kinetic theory of gases, the idea that the gas, the air around you is actually made up of many, many molecules moving very, very fast. He also gave the second mile marker in electricity and magnetism. It's called it was a mechanical theory, physical lines of force. We'll get to that in a moment. But again, with all of the teaching, and there were several benefits to being in London. He got to associate with Michael Faraday, who himself is worthy of a talk. Faraday is one of the greatest experiments of all time. Was an orphan, found himself as a bookbinder apprentice, who then someone realized his ability, and then became the head lecturer at the Royal Society eventually, but without a formal education of any kind, no doctor, no mistress. Faraday had no aspiration of even attempting to do mathematics. So all of these great findings in electricity, magnetism, chemistry, electrochemistry, but he needed a theorist, and this is where Maxwell would come along. But they got to engage with one another, and even there was some amusement. So Maxwell, he shows mathematically that the air around us is full of gas molecules. Sounds a bit atomistic. Some people have opinions about atomistic viewpoints. And Faraday once caught Maxwell in the midst of a crowd and not able to get to the doorway because of how crowded the room was. And he says, "Oh, Faraday, you're like one of your molecules or Maxwell, you're like one of your molecules over here," chiding at him. So they had a good friendship. Maxwell was a man of letters, but London was very busy. He wanted time for reflection. So after another 5-6 year stint, he resigned his post and went home to Glenlair. So country living, this is like Cicero leaving Rome to go reflect and write. Good writing. This is where he did most of his thinking for the kind of monumental work of the Treatise of Electricity and Magnetism. Did some more thinking on the kinetic theory, but also was just a local minister lord, if you will. So he extended the house on the property. It was a modest property, about, you can think maybe two cottages adjoined together, with a sizable land footprint. But he took care of those under his watch on the land. He also patronized the founding of a parish. So there was no parish church at the time. He contributed significantly financially and also helped raise support otherwise. They were able to obtain a parish and to support a clergyman. Maxwell then being an elder because of his property falling within the parish. And so this is where he'll make one more stop here in a moment, down to England again, but we find that he took his duties seriously enough that he would travel back up to Scotland by train every Easter to help administer communion for the local church. So there was several other little things. There was a local school that was going to close, and he sought to fight it, a fight that he couldn't quite win before he passed. A man of the country, but a man that cared locally for the people, and he also just kind of enjoyed getting to be around the rocks and trees again that he loved so well growing up. And also riding ponies. Bought his wife a pony, got smallpox, almost died. His wife enjoyed the pony, though. They would ride frequently in the afternoons. He took up one final post. He was coaxed to going back to Cambridge, so this is trip to England number 3, to found the Cavendish Library. So this is where Maxwell kind of gets a taste for modern science as we know it. He kind of oversaw the building, so the patronization, the funds, the building, the lab equipment, the purchasing, the recruitment of young researchers and their own training. The Cavendish Library did okay. Interestingly enough, Maxwell did not pursue any work on electricity and magnetism, for which he was already famous at this point, because he felt it too difficult, and he felt a devotion towards the laboratory, wanting it to have a good reputation as soon as possible. And so he encouraged researchers to pursue things that were more accessible. I think that the foundations he laid, which, by the way, he had inscribed in the marble, "Great are the works of the Lord," from the Psalm. The foundation he laid seemed to work well. The Cavendish Library was of some note. It helped discover things like the atomic nucleus and DNA and produced 30 Nobel laureates over the next century. And so his hand in the founding of that, he did well. He also spent a significant amount of time, 5 years' worth, of editing the works of Henry Cavendish. Maxwell, even to the end of his life, after he was an eminent scientist of his own, and biographers bemoan this point, he still was caught up with reading scientists of the past in their original, and edited the works in this case. At age 48, around the age his mother passed, he started to experience heartburn. And after some initial remedies, continued to work at it, ignored it until he could ignore it no longer. He went to go see a doctor who then informed him that he also was suffering from abdominal cancer and that he had a month to live. And after what appeared to be a few days of perhaps a recovery, he succumbed to the cancer at age 48. His life cut short. But he said, he noted to someone, he was quite content with his lot in life. He said, "The only desire which I have is, like David, to serve my own generation by the will of God and then to fall asleep." So let's reflect a little bit on some of the scientific work that we mentioned and see how that rich faith, alluded to, tied into it. So, mention the color. So how did Maxwell get to the RGB theory? So with credit, he basically took an idea from an old professor of natural philosophy of his, James Forbes, and started to play with these color tops or color wheels. Basically, you can imagine a wheel on a handle, quite literally, red, blue, and green. He started with other colors, tried them out, and just spun it until he got the color that he wanted to see, and worked about the various combinations. Interestingly enough, all of the other humans he interacted with did not want him to stare into their pupils while he spun strange devices, and so he utilized his love of dogs and their love of him early on. So we then have an imagery of Maxwell going to dogs and spinning the wheels and staring into their pupils to see the right color. Eventually, humans took to it and were willing to try it out. He noticed, and this is where I may get in trouble with my lack of knowledge in ophthalmology, but there is apparently, in most humans, though not all, a spot, a yellow spot, a very faint yellow spot where the reception of the rods and cones don't quite work. He discovered this. There's a few other interesting details about the story. He had to put it together in a theory. He used a geometric triangle. He used different algebra combinations to get an RGB theory. He had to, and by the way, he also then put this in a technological practice and produced the world's first color photograph, putting the three films together. So if you enjoy seeing things on a screen through color, you can thank Clerk Maxwell. In addition to the fact that that device also operates on electricity and magnetism, which he gave us the theory for. So color photograph, which was a bit of a fluke as a detail. So Saturn, how do we do Saturn? So Maxwell's imagination and creativity shows in a lot of his mathematical work because he basically takes an area of mathematics that hadn't been used in a particular application and brings it together. So he thinks through analogy, he sees connections in places where otherwise they weren't seen. So where this comes to bear in Saturn is in case 2. So case 1, can the rings of Saturn be solid? This is a problem of mechanics. The rings are so large that you actually have to account for their own gravitation and its interaction with the planet. In addition to fun things like shear stress as the planet spins around, angular momentum, all the things. He went to work on it. It's a problem of mechanics, and he showed that except for a bizarre distribution of the matter where basically 4/5 of the matter was all on a single point, which is not, we couldn't have a solid ring. With liquid, he used the runaway vibrational stability. So he brings together these kind of instabilities. This is where it's actually a field of study that we would now call harmonics. Maybe we'll get to show some of you students this someday. So a way to think about why you can't have a massive liquid ring out in space just whirling about with the stabilities is to think of maybe an inverse problem. So in an automobile, if it's powered by gasoline or diesel fuel, the way in which you take the liquid fuel and get it into gaseous form is it's injected through a high-pressure nozzle. And the way that nozzle works, in addition to straining out the liquid through holes, it would still come out in globules. But as it's careening through the air at fast speeds being injected into the combustion chamber, the air on the liquid will create a shear stress, right, that will then cause the fluid to stretch and warp. And that stretching and warping will actually rip it apart and make even smaller and smaller atoms, atomized droplets, not atoms, but atomized droplets. It's technical language. Very small molecules that will then evaporate. So think about it in the other way. If you want a giant ring out in space that's whirling about, you don't want these instabilities, but nonetheless they're there. So no liquid ring of Saturn. But Fortunately, the prize awarders would not just take process of elimination, so he had to make a positive show of why it would be a series of satellites. So he basically wrote out all the mathematics for let's have a single ring of equally spaced particles with a low enough average density so that it would be stable in orbit. Okay, and he showed that that would be true. But now let's do a second ring. And an interesting result of this is that there are some arrangements where even if you have two rings that would be stable on their own, together in the wrong arrangement would lead to destructive resonance. But he did find that some stable arrangements would be allowed. This is a kind of orbital resonance, if you want to go look up the term. Perhaps this is Maxwell's contribution to the music of the spheres, because there are discrete locations in the continuous media where you can have stability and a pleasant sound. He submitted the paper. There were no other entrants, but they took it, awarded him the prize. And no one really developed on Maxwell's work further until the 1970s, when the man-made spacecraft of the Voyager series, Voyager 1 and 2, flew by and said, oh, yeah, Maxwell's right. There's a bunch of satellites up in the air, right? A triumph for him, using the power of mathematics a century prior. He also did work on control systems, so within different scientific apparatus, you basically have conditions in the lab where you want to control a process. Imagine a wheel, some device that's moving, and you want it to move with a consistent speed. Back in the old days, when you had to pump up a flywheel, get something moving, right? The act of pumping it up, you give it inertia, you give it momentum, you give it an impetus, but then it decays. Things that are in fluctuation are not good for experiments. You need something steady. So the technology of what's called a governor had been around for a while, but it was Maxwell that analyzed these, and this is his country thinking. I'm just going to think about these governors, and he produced a theory of it. So a general theory of what we now refer to as control systems, the idea that you have a feedback loop from the output back into the input. So if you've been in a vehicle today by land or sea or air, there's going to be a control system of some kind. Control systems are all over our technology. The founders of the field of cybernetics actually cite Maxwell. There's two reasons why they coined the theory of control systems as cybernetics. One, because it comes from the word for a pilot in a ship. It's a reference to Plato. And two, because governor and Kubernetes are etymologically linked, and so it's a tip of the hat towards Maxwell. So color, Saturn, governors, these are Maxwell's minor achievements. They're minor in the sense that the minor prophets are minor. You should respect them in and of themselves. They're short and brief and launched entire fields of their own. He did work in thermodynamics. He developed what are now called the Maxwell relations. In short, if you want to ask what are the base variables or the base constituents of what's happening in a thermodynamic system, whether it be internal energy, entropy, pressure, temperature, or all the ways in which those things are related. There's various partial derivatives that you can take to show that one is related to the other. I can't do this without a diagram or formula to place in front of you. I'm so sorry. Note that he has his name borne on some relations in thermodynamics, and also within that field that he crafted a grand thought experiment. So I don't have to steal from the next upcoming theme of the gas theory, but take it for granted that through Maxwell, we now think that, at his time, he now thinks, and many others, that the gas around us, many, many molecules. And he has this idea about the way in which heat would flow through the molecules. So in short, if you think of the temperature, or you should think of this this way. This is correct. The temperature of a gas is the average kinetic energy of the molecule. So basically, through a concept called the Boltzmann constant and another factor, you can link the temperature directly to the average of 1/2 mv squared. For those of you who know your kinetic energy equation of all of the molecules on aggregate. And so there's a link between moving molecules and temperature. Now, something to know about thermodynamics and temperature, you may know this. Some of you probably know this. We drink enough coffee here that you should know this. If you warm up your coffee and you set it down and forget to drink it, it will no longer be warm after a while. It will be at an equilibrium temperature with the room. Heat flows from high temperature to low temperature, not the other way around. I mean, has anybody had their lukewarm coffee spontaneously reheat? Boltzmann says it's possible. I've yet to have any evidence of it. I don't think Maxwell would hold to it, because you would have a reduction in entropy. So a consequence of the mathematics behind that heat flow from warm to cold in the equilibration is that entropy increases. And the second law of thermodynamics is that in a closed system, entropy will always increase. There's possibilities that are never real, that it would maintain its same value, but it always increases. It never decreases, at least in a closed system. So then, Maxwell has this thought experiment. Let's take two chambers, have gas molecules in them. Two chambers, here and here, separated by a barrier. This one's hot, this one's cold. Remove the barrier. And what will happen? Heat will flow from this way to this way. I'm facing you. So this way to this way. We're going to say this way instead of left to right. Okay? This happens on a molecular level because the molecules are all colliding with each other. And you can think, even through the randomness, right, it will eventually diffuse. The fast-moving molecules will diffuse into the side where all the slow-moving molecules, the cold ones, were. And likewise, and at that equilibration moment, you will have a uniform distribution, statistically speaking, of the molecules. So Maxwell then posits this idea. So what if we had an intelligent being? This is later termed Maxwell's demon. I don't think he called it a demon. Descartes had a demon. Maxwell, all the greats have demons, I guess. So the daemonic Aristotle. Okay, so he imagined this intelligent being that's sitting at the barrier that can open and close the gate. He says, okay, let it equilibrate. Well, what if then this entity is paying attention to the molecules that are approaching the gate? And when, from one side, if I let all the fast ones they approach the gate, if I open the gate really quick, let the fast one go through and shut it again, and then on the other side, I let the slow ones as they slowly approach slip through, I'll eventually be able to shift all the fast ones to this side, all the slow ones to this side, and then I'll have fast and slow, or thermodynamically, I will have recreated a cold and hot temperature gradient, which means that I also would have violated the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, so how did this little being do this? This put people in fits for decades. Until around 1929, someone, and I had a lapse for the name, but basically someone postulated the idea that, well, hey, maybe this entity, if it's physical, has to actually have information about the system. And to have information about the system, right, I have to compute, I have to know, it's going to require energy to obtain information. And through the resolution of Maxwell's thought experiment, the foundations of information theory are laid. Right? So now when you either have to, when you create a bit of information in a computer or remove it, there are thermodynamic constraints on the amount of energy required to create information in a technical sense or remove it. And this has had deep ramifications. The implications of the resolution of this paradox are still being felt. Quantum computing to this day is built around, this is one of the issues addressed with it. So how to make a supercomputer, there's a limit on the energy needed to read and write and delete information. And all of this started because of Maxwell's little crazy thought experiment. Also, as a methodology, this is the origin of, at least some have claimed, it's the origin of the Gedanken experiment. So Einstein leaning back in his chair, thinking about a man in an elevator, a man in space, right? Thought experiments as a method can be traced back to Maxwell. So I've already kind of alluded now to the secondary grand result of Maxwell, the kinetic theory of gases. What he does to show that the gas molecules are actually statistical is there's a couple moves he has to make. He has to intuit things such as the velocities in their various component directions are all independent of one another, but even the application of statistics itself to a physical process is novel. Right? So this is the mid to late 1800s. Statistics and probability statistics itself is a developing field. Today it is all over the place. You can't have quantum mechanics without statistical mechanics. So the very idea of saying I'm going to think statistically is in a sense quite radical. So he's able, through the intuition about what's going on, using the mind's eye and the molecules, the utilization of statistics, he actually generated what's now a shared title with Boltzmann, who later took up his work, the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. So we can claim with accuracy that for a given mass set of mass of molecules, if you know the chemical composition and some other factors, and you know its temperature, you know something about its velocity distribution. What is the average? What is the mean velocity of those molecules? What are the standard deviations on either side? It creates a bell curve of sorts. and the way in which that shapes, right? So as the temperature increases in the gas molecules, you'll actually have a larger standard deviation. And this is all due to Maxwell and his innovative techniques. And it would later be taken up by Boltzmann, the Austrian physicist who did work of his own that we can't get to tonight. So then, this brings us to the gem in the crown, electricity and magnetism. Maxwell plays with electricity and magnetism at three or four different phases in his life. When he begins to work on this, there's a kind of disparate collection of experimental evidence. We know, I'll list, so we know that he knew at the time, it was kind of well known, that there were forces between electric charges, so positive, and that the like repelled like, and positive and negative attracted each other. There were forces between magnetic poles, so north and south attract one another. To this day, there is no evidence of a magnetic monopole, so they always have poles together, so there's forces between those. A current in a wire creates a circular magnetic field around the wire, so if you have current through a wire, the magnetic field lines will move in a circle this way. I may or may not bring up the term curl here in a moment. And finally, though it didn't originate with Faraday really systematized it. It's the theme of magnetic induction. So the idea that a magnetic field induces a current, a moving magnetic field induces current in a wire. This is kind of wild. I don't know if anybody's seen this. You can basically hook up a circuit that doesn't have need of a battery, put it on a light bulb, move a magnet. There are some caveats about the circuitry required, the strength of the magnet, etc. But you can get a light to shine through the moving magnetic field, the moving magnet in the field, excuse me. And here I've already given away the game by speaking of a field. At the time, the world was full of Newtonianism, action at a distance. I have bodies that move, there's nothing in between them, space is between them, whatever space is, and there has to be action. Leibniz famously called Newton's theory of gravitation an occult theory, because if the world is made out of moving bodies that have to interact with each other by contact, by force, what is the means by which gravity is transmitted? How does a body know to be attracted? Well, you don't know. There's the occult. That's what's left, right? And one of the upshots of what Maxwell does through giving a theory to these experimental results is to eliminate that thinking. So he does this in a few phases. So rather than action at a distance, Faraday, when we do need to give a significant amount of Faraday for Faraday's belief in what are called lines of force. It's probably the best way to visualize this. There's some disanalogy, but the best way to visualize this, if you can imagine the child's toy you had with the iron filings that kind of move with the magnet, and there's different shapes depending on the way the magnet moves around. Think about that, and you can see various lines. Perhaps some of you have seen lines of force. Faraday saw these. He's one of the first to see these and give a systematic account experimentally of it. And he says that these things are real. Others try to work out action. Faraday says, no, these lines of force are real. But again, Faraday has no mathematical training. He can't verify it theoretically. So Maxwell comes along. Again, creativity, just willing to take a risk. He said, I think Faraday's not that crazy. I'm gonna see what I can do with this. So Maxwell, in phase one, he imagined tubes. So again, this is space. There are no tubes in space. Where are the tubes? I can't feel the tubes. I can't see this. But he imagined that there are tubes that electric or magnetic flux would travel through. And that this flux would be caused by electric or magnetic potential. Potential here being a technical term, so this has to do with the potential gradient. It's a vector function, vector calculus function. There's some parallels and some ideas that Maxwell was using related to what was happening with pressure and heat at the time, similar governing equations. But he says, hey, there's a electric or magnetic potential. This potential causes flux through these tubes. You can't see them, but mathematically he was able to show the result that worked for at least the electrostatic and magnetostatic phenomenon that was observed. And this was kind of the first mathematical justification of a field. Okay, so that was early on. I believe this was in the Cambridge Fellowship. On physical lines of force comes later. That was a static phenomenon. He was unable to account for the dynamic field interactions. So we needed to account for the whole current. So current is moving electric charge. We also need to account for a changing magnetic field that would induce the current. So he went about this by imagining, and this is rather wild, and please come up to me afterwards, I can show you some diagrams, but he essentially envisions that space is now filled. We had tubes before, now we have these hexagonal, they're spheres, but they have a hexagonal shape in the diagram. Spheres layered with these steel ball bearings. It's almost like this machine in space. And the ball bearings are what transmit the electric current. And so they're basically pushed. And as they're pushed, and all of this is tight, it turns the wheels above and below them. And the way in which they're turned would actually cause a propagation to the next set of ball bearings, and on and on. And so they would turn. There are several interesting physical results of this. One has to do, and this is a bit detailed, but the way in which the cells, as they spun in a vortex-like fashion, the way they would tighten or expand at different locations would actually create a tension-compression pairing, and would lead to, and again, it's difficult to show, but it would basically lead to a lot of these phenomena. Magnetism works in an orthogonal position from electricity, and so having a dual tension and compression was helpful in this model. But Maxwell stressed this is only a model, and yet, nevertheless, there was mathematics behind it. It was able to give verification to 2 out of those 4 phenomenon, and now we really have something like a field theory proper. And it also gave 2 novel predictions. One is something called a displacement current. So as those wheels turn and move the other ball bearings, those are the currents. Right? So there's a kind of counteracting displacement current. I'd have to take you through a course on electricity and magnetism, but this is where we get displacement currents. And then also there's a propagation through the medium. So wheels turn, ball bearings, wheels turn. It's a propagation through the field. And that propagation acts like a wave through the field. So Maxwell says there's waves in my system. What's going on here? And then he thinks about it, he looks at the property, again, look at the equations, but there's some room for, we call it now the permittivity and the permeability of free space, but properties associated with electric and magnetic entities, if you will. He puts it together and asks it what would be the speed of the propagation of this wave. And interestingly enough, it matches very closely to what was just then reported as the speed of light. And so with this, Maxwell basically has most of the work done. He has a field, he has a union of electricity and magnetism, he can cover induction, and he's now unified it with light. The last step is a dynamic theory of the electric field, and here he steps away from the mechanical model of the mind, and it's more of a mathematical approach. He uses something called Lagrangian mechanics. In vectors is a beauty to Lagrangian mechanics, but I feel like the wheels were enough. Take it on my word. These are quite beautiful equations, and in a sense, the electromagnetic theory is complete at this point. He can cover all 4 phenomena with these. He's unified. He's completed one of the great unifications. So today, when people talk about a theory of everything, the product of grand unification, there's a sense that it starts with union, but it's really Maxwell saying there's electricity, magnetism, and light. They're all the same thing. And the work is complete there. It would be compiled and worked through. There's some advances in the treatise of electricity and magnetism. He uses objects called quaternions, but that's the main ideas behind it. So what does all this mean? Why is this important? That's cool. Light's cool. E&M waves. Let's let Einstein speak to how important he thought it was. So he says, a couple quotes from Einstein, the success of the Faraday-Maxwell interpretation of electromagnetic field theory resulted in physicists becoming convinced that there is no such thing as action at a distance of the type of Newton's law of gravitation. So this is where the greater than Newton stuff comes in. In connection with Faraday and Maxwell, it became more clear that the description of electromagnetic processes in terms of fields was vastly superior to a treatment on the basis of the mechanical concepts of material points. And then again, the work of Faraday, Maxwell, and Hertz, and he said earlier in a passage that Maxwell has the lion's share. Hertz is a German experimentalist that actually gave the evidence for the E&M waves. But the work of Faraday, Maxwell, and Hertz led to the development of modern physics, to the creation of new concepts, forming a new picture of reality. And so this is the work of Maxwell in changing the world as we view it. So he not only gives us a theory that allows us to have some of the technological advances we have, the electronic world that we live in, but even our way of viewing nature, having the field be real, having something in the field. that we're not just bodies and points flying about. It is a new way to see physics, and it takes us up to the threshold of the wild and wacky world of 20th century physics with quantum and whatnot. There is no world of special relativity in quantum mechanics without Maxwell. Just to show, this is not exactly how Einstein originally thought out the thinking of special relativity, but he gave credence to this in his later crystallized thought. One of the ways to get to some of the strangeness of special relativity with things like time dilation and length contraction is to basically say that the laws of physics are the same in all reference frames. So a lot of people get bothered when we talk about special relativity. Is this some kind of subjective relativist thing? Time can change for different people. But it's a corollary of the fact that the laws of physics, which someone like Maxwell would say are ordained by God, are true in all reference frames. And I would rather have humans disagree on how much time was spent than to have different laws of physics in different reference frames. And where the speed of light comes in, and the speed of light being the same in all reference frame, is that unlike bodily motion, where we can accelerate and change, because light is a propagation of an electromagnetic field, because the laws governing that field are the same, the speed of light is the same in all reference frames for a given medium. It's invariant. A whole new world, a whole new picture of reality indeed. Thomas Kuhn, 20th century historian of science, said that Maxwell's equations were as revolutionary as Einstein's. Okay, so a little bit about the man. I've gotten excited talking about science. Let's talk a little bit about the man before we end. So did Maxwell see any relationship? We've talked a little bit about his personal piety. Is there any relationship, religion, science for him? Let's see up a little bit. So anecdote, while I'm working through my notes, Scottish Presbyterian background. He also was quite familiar with the Anglican liturgy. His mother's side of the family was of the Scottish Episcopal Church. And he even, while he was in London, he attended Baptist services. There's no evidence of this, but it is quite possible he heard sermons from Charles Haddon Spurgeon. He read scripture in the morning with his wife, as mentioned. He composed prayers, so our students, we read aloud together one of his prayers that he composed as a second lovely prayer. He wrote, "Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens, and out of the mouths of infants and babes has perfected praise. When we consider the heavens, the works of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, teach us to know that thou art mindful of us and visited us. Make us rulers over the works of thy hands, showing us the wisdom of thy work and crowning us with honor and glory in our earthly life. And going higher than the heavens, may we see Jesus made a little lower than angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor. He, by the grace of God, who should taste death for every man. But fulfill thy promise and put all things in subjection under his feet. Let sin be rooted out of the earth and let the wicked be no more. Thou, O Lord, O my soul, praise the Lord." So we see the piety. There was a lot of things happening in Victorian England in regard to religion and science. He doesn't give any direct shots. There is one small anecdote in a letter about a gripe about Spencerian evolution and its bold claims, a little bit outside of his professional work. So what he does say, as noted, interestingly, Maxwell worked a lot with molecules. He even said something to my bane. He said something quite positive about Lucretius in a student essay, and then quoted him in the Latin when he was a young man. But Maxwell's take on molecules was not quite Epicurean. So two things. He wrote a discourse on molecules. This may have been motivated by John Tyndall and Thomas Huxley running around preaching materialism. And Maxwell, without directly attacking them, would give a lecture that got them excited. So discourse on molecules, one of the things which he says that there's basically a limit. So by tracing back the history of matter, science is arrested when she assures herself on the one that the molecule's been made on the other, that it has not been made by any of the processes we call natural. Science is incompetent to reason upon the creation of matter itself out of nothing. We have reached the utmost limit of our thinking faculties when we have admitted that because matter cannot be eternal and self-existed, it must have been created. It is only when we contemplate not matter in of itself, but the form in which it actually holds, that our minds find something on which it can lay hold. And so where did the molecules come from? Why are they in the order that they are in? Furthermore, he talks about their invariance over the eons. So they continue this day as they were created, perfect in number, measure, and weight. And in the ineffaceable characters impressed upon them, we may learn that those aspiring after accuracy in measurement and just in action, which we reckon among our noblest attributes, because they are essential constituents of the image of Him who in the beginning created not only the heavens and the earth, but the materials out of which the heaven and earth consist. Divine atoms, divine molecules, if you will. Perhaps not atoms, divine molecules. There are fields after all. Probably the most direct quote we have of Maxwell's thought on the relationship of science and religion comes with an inquiry made by an Anglican bishop. So Maxwell working with light. There, if you recall, in Genesis 1, there's a sequence of creation that is given much to think about over the ages. That we get our light from the sun. We have these thanks to Maxwell and Faraday, right? So our light and candles, right? But the great light from the sun. Well, the sun was made on the fourth day, and we have light earlier than the fourth day. How is this possible? Is it the ether? So Maxwell kind of held to an idea of the ether to the end of his life, as far as we know. And so, is it the ether? Is that what's going on? Can we basically take your understanding of the ether and say, Genesis 1 is right after all, and modern science supports it? Is that the way we should go? Maxwell has an interesting comment on not just that particular idea, but a general approach to Scripture and science. If it were necessary to provide an interpretation of the text in accordance with the science of 1876, which may not agree with the science of 1896, it would be very tempting to say that the light of the first day means the all-embracing ether, the vehicle of radiation, and not actual light, whether from the sun or from any other source. But I cannot suppose that this was the very idea meant to be conveyed by the original author of the book for those for whom he was writing. He tells us of a previous darkness. Both light and darkness imply a being who can see if there is light, but not if it is dark, and the words are always understood so. That light and darkness are terms relative to the creature only is recognized in Psalm 139:12. But I should be very sorry if an interpretation founded on a most conjectural scientific hypothesis were to get fastened to the text in Genesis, even if by so doing it got rid of the old statement of the commentators, which has long ceased to be intelligible. The rate of change of scientific hypothesis is naturally much more rapid than that of biblical interpretations. So that if any interpretation is founded on such a hypothesis, it may help to keep the hypothesis above ground long after it ought to have been buried and forgotten. At the same time, I think that each individual man should do all he can to impress his own mind with the extent, the order, and the unity of the universe, and should carry these ideas with him as he reads such passages as the first chapter of the first epistle of the epistle to the Colossians, just as enlarged conceptions of the extent and unity of the world of life may be of service to us in reading Psalm 8, Hebrews 2:6, etc., etc. Maxwell, who drew on the rich tradition of reading those that came before him, he knew the history of science well. He saw how science changed, and that certainly came to bear on his belief in the unchangingness of the Christian faith, to which he held to the end of his life. Science changes before Scripture ever will. Thus, with a man that spawned one of the greatest, if perhaps the greatest, of the scientific revolutions that we have known thus far in humans roaming about the earth. He ends, let us end with two notes that he said that showed his commitment to the Christian faith and his belief in it in the end. So as he was dying, he said to someone, old chap, I have read up many a strange religion, and there is nothing like the old thing after all. Sounds much older than his 48 years would show. And then finally, I have looked into most philosophical systems, and I have seen none that will work without a God. Ladies and gentlemen, James Clerk Maxwell, physicist, faithful Christian unto the end.
Dr. Johnson, thank you. That was fascinating. makes me wish that he would come teach at New College.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for staying with me, by the way. So in STEM, we lecture and people listen. This is a new teaching mode, and since you all get to tell me so many wonderful things, we have discussions together, I thought I would just, let it out. So thank you for bearing with me for an hour. Oops.
Yes. I'm glad that clock is off by an hour. Otherwise, it's already 8:40. So the first thing I wanted to kind of point out was I love that poem that you read, and that line, the old world, new truths inspire, really struck me. If you were just kind of speculate about his forays into the old world, you said he read classic literature, he read moral philosophy, he was trained in Greek and Latin, he was a classicist, and then he did science. So he's steeped in the old world, but then he's discovering all these new things. How do you think his forays into things we would say like not science actually aided his scientific kind of endeavors?
Yeah, so, probably one of the first things that comes to mind, and I didn't get a chance to there was more. He had to write student essays probably like some of you have. I know like some of you had. What is the difference between Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and Epicureans? Seeing the breadth of possibility of ideas that the physical cosmos could be made out of, I would imagine open the mind, especially to one that was already by nature just kind of wild in his imagination, to say, like, what could there be? Like, do I have to be constrained by what is, like, especially, and also, too, the second point is by thinking through the philosophical tradition of natural philosophy, of understanding a model as it is, right? So especially of scientism or a burgeoning scientism, and saying, like, no, this is a model, which is helpful. There's some truth to it. There's a realism to it, but it's not, there's more to reality than that. So one, having a model, two, the kind of breadth of like what that model could entail. I think all of that reading plays into it. Atoms and fields and receptacles and all the fun things.
Right. So I have a lot of questions, like Leibniz, the cold gravity, more about Maxwell's demons and quantum linking with particles. Could we hypothesize a liquid ring around another planet? Different means of doing that physically. But I figured I should focus on questions that might apply to what we're doing in New College. So, one, it struck me how playful Maxwell was throughout so much of his life. I was reading a bit about him online, and it seems he wrote many physics poems as well, and physics songs, especially to like Irish tunes. Like he wrote one on mechanics called "Gin a body, meet a body, flying through the air. Gin a body, hit a body, will it fly and where?" Like Irish pub songs about mechanics. Like this dude's super playful. He's writing real poetry as well.
Yep.
He's learning how to construct ovals better than anybody else. He's developing color photographs for the first time. He's hitting so many different fields of science. What accounts for that, I guess, playfulness? It seems that that's key to everything that he accomplished in a sense. But why? Is there anything in his history or like, I don't know, what do you have to say to that?
I think if I wanted to cheer from the crowd, I would say that like Maxwell is the dream of every homeschool boy that's ever been called strange for having different ideas and wanting to play and be out there unstructured. Freedom to play, and then he just became one of the greatest scientists of all time and kept the faith. It's like, I would imagine, part of it's probably disposition, but he did seem to have like a lack of structure, and this is where I mentioned somewhat to his detriment, right? Sitting for that Tripos exam, he had a tutor that was like, hey, dude, you need to like have some rigor here, right? We've all been there, right? Some of us on the whiteboard, have that feel of like, this is here and this is here. It seems somewhat natural, probably though some of it from his educational backing. It is notable, even more so. Thank you for bringing that one up. That one didn't make it in. He was considered eccentric, though. Yeah. Sometimes his jokes wouldn't take. They were to be appreciated by people of like-minded disposition.
Is there a relationship, and you touched on this, between that and also just sort of his view of the role of science and his relationship with God?
With the playfulness or just in general?
Yeah,
or?
well, specifically. has this sort of playful, like he has this freedom to do this science that I don't know, I feel like I would be so burdened by a lot of it and the responsibility and different things. But he has this, it doesn't seem ultimate to him. Like you mentioned one of those things that he was commenting on his deathbed. Like, there's all these different philosophies, none of them work without God. And I read some other things that he said that were kind of similar, even with science, where he's just saying, like, ultimately, what I know of God and his word is just far and above so much greater than him. And it allows him to.
Yeah, I think that his open-mindedness certainly played into a kind of ecumenism. It's probably too early to call it ecumenism proper, but his whole, like, at home in Presbyterianism, and he read Edwards and Owens, but like, I like the Anglican liturgy. I'm going to go hear what the Baptists have to say. That's quite a bit of openness for his time. Probably the only negative comment about a religious take is that when he went on the grand tour to Italy, so Catherine and he visited France and Italy, he enjoyed the music in Rome, but he was like, oh, the Pope's band. 19th century Calvinist, the Pope's band. But I think that kind of openness, at times there is a little bit of frustration in his writings that he doesn't come out a little bit more and actually tease that out. It almost leads to an indication of a personal pietism at times, of like, you should be a Christian, the dogmas of the faith are true, but like, I'm not going to go and exposit my theology. Like, he spent Sunday reading the Divines, as he said, reading the Westminster Divines, but like, he wouldn't write about it and tell people that. Part of that's his humility and his modesty. Part of it is his own take of like, I have it, I'm open-minded, maybe he didn't want to ruffle feathers. There is a kind of open-mindedness going on with him as well.
Yeah, along those lines, it just strikes me that playfulness and humility and how he approaches his science, recognizing that it changes, right? I mean, it's an amazing thing to say as you're looking back in your own work, that I'm in a field that will always change, right? It takes incredible humility and willingness to play at it, knowing that his theories might be debunked in 30, 40 years. And then looking at something like Scripture or the old divines and saying like, this is what endures, I think that's something that probably all of us could probably.
Yeah, he didn't have anyone advocating in the press, jockeying. Quite different from Newton, and he had the clout to have pulled a Newton and said, put this in the international press, let the Germans and the French know about this. No, it's just, I'm gonna like David, live for my time, do what's right, and go to sleep, and let everybody else figure it out. And it might change. That it is. You rarely see someone of such ability and accomplishment have that humility. It is truly remarkable. As I mentioned, a great scientist, but also a good man. So, good.
Yeah, okay, so help me out with this. Years ago, when I was at St. John's, I got really excited about Euclid, and because we were studying Euclid, and I was living with a guy who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, so he's like a very, very smart physicist person. You know what happened at Los Alamos, right? And he's like, oh yeah, Euclid. And then I was kind of telling him about, at St. John's we kind of study the history of math and science, and he kind of made this comment about like, some of those guys are great, but like Newton couldn't do any of the math that we do now. Interesting. And kind of putting these guys, Maxwell, Newton, in their place. Like, they don't know advanced math like we do. And it kind of stopped me in my tracks a little bit and made me think, like, how would you communicate to somebody who is engaging in physics, engaging in trying to discover new things, that it's still valuable to have the education that Maxwell, for example, had? Yeah. Or have we gotten to a point where things are so specialized and the math is so advanced that you really couldn't have somebody who's dabbling in astrophysics and electromagnetism and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so the couple things happen. I mean, one, science itself has become so specialized now. No one has the accomplishments in the breadth that Maxwell does, where you would specialize in a field, and the math gets more specialized. So it'd be hard today. I still think it's worth aspiring to for the general education. I mean, so again, classically trained, lots of Euclid, and I think there was some calculus around the time of University of Edinburgh. Maxwell's not really transitioning into natural philosophy, though, until somewhere between 16 and 19. But then he read immensely. So he was able to, you don't even want to use the word catch up, per se, but an immense intellect, a lot of reading, he just put the effort there. So it can be done. His relationship to Euclid specifically, though, so this is interesting that comment's made. So Maxwell, he published, in addition to E&M, the last years of his life, he published a couple works. So there was The Theory of Heat and also a text called Matter in Motion. It was like one of the very last crystallized mechanical philosophies. So force, torque, energy, all the good stuff. There's no vectors in it. And vectors, not only did he use vectors in his electromagnetic theory, but he also used quaternions, so that was an up-and-coming thing that was, in some sense, supplanted by vectors. Quaternions is a hypercomplex system. You have your IJK and a scalar component. So very well versed in it, but when he goes to his mechanics, it's geometry. It's like triangles and rectangles. There's a simplicity to it. He even drew some type of, I'm going to get this wrong, but there was some type of almost like a bridge truss design that he designed that the engineers then took and utilized with it, but it's kind of like a symmetry argument. So there is some value to that. But I would say that he also advocated, so he both respected Euclid. He used the tradition of that. And I made the gripe, that's like a student gripe. He loved mathematics. He liked doing props. He did some props for fun. But he also, he would advocate for going further. So one of the things that he did during his second bout at Cambridge was he advocated for a kind of reform of that Tripos exam, because England was falling behind France and Germany in terms of their mathematical knowledge. So there's a kind of both a traditionalist strand and an innovativeness to him. The easy answer is just do all the things. Read all the time, stay up so late on Friday night that you have to crash Saturday morning, right? It can be done. I don't see any detriment. I mean, in a sense, for the classical movement as a whole, like there needs to be more Euclid faster. If you're a classical educator, please do all of the Euclid in high school, and we'll do even more fun geometry and stuff here. We're waiting on that. We're waiting on you guys. Do all of Euclid in high school. Yes. Yes, both, and do all the things. Geometry's great.
Next question was actually very similar to that, so I'm trying to decide if I modify it or I skip it, but I think I still do want to kind of connect it a little bit. So, we talked a little bit about Faraday, and he has like almost no training. Like he's bookbinding, and then he like ends up in like magnetics and electricity with some really fantastic experiments and discoveries, right? Yeah. Which is wild. And I was also thinking still about Maxwell and some of just the playfulness and creativity of his experiments. Like he's spinning colored tops for dogs. Like that was wild, right? And he's discovering things about color and the way that it works through that. And I guess what I was saying, what I wanted to ask is like how far beyond like a new college student is some of like what we're really talking about? I feel like a lot of it gets shrouded in jargon and stuff. So I remember you gave a presentation to the faculty recently on calculus. Yeah. And as I thought about it, I was like, you know, a lot of what he's saying is not actually that complicated. There's a lot of technical jargon. It looks super complicated, but is there a sense in which like it's not so unfeasible for a student at New College even to like start being creative with some of these things and seeing the world in a new way? Or has science just gotten so far that it's like, you know what, the bridge is too far, we can't spin tops for dogs anymore. Like you need, you know, your PhD in engineering and environmental engineering and all those things.
No, I think science needs that. There is, I mean, without getting into anecdotes about why I kind of turned my back on mainstream research and ended up at New College happily so, I think that's lacking. I mean, there is an almost like, science itself is almost like a great machine. And some of that is there. Some of that is, let's get immediate results, something that can make money. So you want to joke about Faraday. So Faraday, during one of his electrical demonstrations, the prime minister came up to him and was only moderately impressed. And so he's like, well, what's the use of this? So Faraday, with his gifts, knowing what the prime minister was getting, he said, sir, one day you can tax this. And that's kind of what we think sometimes. There's less play. I mean, there's aspects of Maxwell's life that's like, the freedom to do that, though. I mean, there's a certain amount of privilege. He won a prize. He won a fellowship. He had freedom to pursue things. He also was of a class that it's like, I'm going to peace out for 5 years and go to my country estate and just think about some of this stuff. So there's a little bit of uniqueness in his story that may not be accessible to all. But that general mentality, that ethos, I think we can do more of that. I think that our approach, I've talked with some of our students about, how they were, some of the drill and kill stuff. Where Maxwell, I think, would share with our students is like, why do I have to learn how to compute a trigonometric function, 28 different ways, and that's my understanding of trigonometry instead of doing a proof, instead of doing a diagram. That kind of kills creativity. Yep. So fostering that, that's part of the project that we have here that I think is fantastic. You should see, there's some awesome geometry journals out there, and students pushing past. I think we're on the way. There's more work to do. There's more work to do.
We're going to open it up to y'all, and we've got a microphone that's going to be passed around. So if you just want to raise your hand if you have a question, and then Mr. Gulliver will give you the microphone.
Thanks. This was awesome. So let's do a thought experiment. If James Clerk Maxwell was born, say, in 2000, and he loves mathematics, science, could he have discovered the things that he discovered if he went through the traditional mainstream, got to chase grants, or would he have to just kind of be a classicist and just try to figure stuff out on his own? Basically, is the scientific machinery obstructionist to creativity, or is it necessary to do the kind of discoveries he did?
It obstructs in several ways, and I can say this for those mentors in my life that I have had that have gone the route and been tenured at R1, fully tenured, and dreamt about this stuff. You think, what causes a young man or young woman to want to go into science? And they went out with that, and they got into the grind, got to get my grants, got to, get my tenure package, and by the time they're 47, 50, however it is, before they can get away from all of the requirements, there's not much time left. And also the creative youthfulness, right? There's some sense the really fantastic work, the imaginative work, is a young man or young woman's game. More so in mathematics. There's some work that happens later in a physicist's life. I've been around a professor at Duke University that was able to have a grand theory after they spent their time chasing the game with heat exchangers for a little bit. It can be done. It is rare, and the scope is not as much. Even the way. So if you ask, what would he have done if he had had a regular bit of training? So that tutor that I said he revolted against. So the tutor came, tried to do drill and kill, cracked the knuckles, and Maxwell. He was of calm demeanor. There were almost no accounts of outbursts, at least in the biography or the hagiography. He ran away from the house and got into the little boat on the pond and waited out in the water, and he just wouldn't come in. Waited for his father to come home. He just sat there. There is something that's stifling to creativity. I don't know if, I think that there are elements within our movement that are pushing towards an openness, an ability to play. There are other people working in the quadrivium that use terms like puzzle proof and play. How can we think like that more? There's a need for reform. I don't see him getting many. It's like a statistical average, like a molecule, but no, there are probably more Maxwell stifled today than there are facilitated.
So you mentioned that Maxwell is kind of credited for thought experiments. In what way did his thought experiments vary from or differ from what we see in Pythagoras or people who preceded him that did a lot of thought experiments instead of actual experiment or what we think of as actual experiments?
just to push a little bit, like what do you have in mind with Pythagoras? Because there's like a mathematical imagination, but there's the kind of elaborate machinery kind of out in mental space. Do you have something in mind?
Yeah, I'm having trouble remembering what they're called, but in cosmology we did like mechanics, and you'd have, I remember like two men on a boat, and they had with the pendulums and stuff like that, and where it was all very thought through, and like these experiments were thought through. I'm just curious, like in what way his thought experiments were like revolutionary as opposed to like what came before in thought experiment.
Yeah, so that is probably one of the areas where I thought the biographers were being a bit bold, but I do think there's a claim in the sense that with a lot of these other experiments, so like there's a famous one with the relativity of motion, like the Galilean relativity of motion. Two people on a boat pass each other, or if someone were walking on a ship that's not moving, or walking on the land perhaps, or the ship's moving, how do I add? But all those things are experiences that we could actually have. You could actually get on a boat and walk and try it out. Toss something and see if it fell one way or the other. What's kind of odd is like the where he goes, like there's the microscopic nature. Probably the closest I can imagine is something like Cartesian, but what Descartes is doing is nothing like imagining like a physical cosmos with all of these molecules in a room. It's the extent to which it is like almost otherworldly, I would imagine. That's different, but I can also imagine a few others where like, no, Maxwell's not the first to like imagine a scenario. But he gets credit for kind of inciting that as an ethos, at least in contemporary physics. So yeah, good caveat. Yeah.
So you're telling me that the demon isn't actually out there?
Thank you. No, probably more or less real. I mean, there are devices that have information. I mean, there's little. I could go all kind of fun places with this. We'll just let it be. Well, like I said, let Newton be the occultist and Maxwell be the guy that removed us from such things. I don't know, could angels violate the second law of thermodynamics? Maybe there's a missing stanza in that poem. It said there's two stanzas omitted. Maybe that's what was in there, right? Because you got the god angels with molecules. That's the missing stanza of the poem.
I just have a really bland, clarifying question. Wonderful lecture. That was so fun. With the Maxwell's demon deal, are we saying basically the solution is that well, you said it was a closed system, well, it's not a closed system, or are we saying, well, it is a closed system, but the demon is just part of the system, and then would it still work if it was immaterial?
Good. Yeah, so this is where it actually would have to be like an incorporeal entity to actually pull it off. Because anything physically, it would need not only the mind to be able to gather the information about the system, right, but have to open and close the gates as a physicality. To do all of those things, you need an energy input. The demon has to eat. I guess it's no longer a demon. Right, and then you're importing energy, because assuming you're not taking it out of the gas molecule somehow, you're importing energy, and this is where it falls apart. Right, so just like any kind of computing device that reads and writes and destroys information, deletes information, you have to have an energy input. We normally don't think about it, but it comes through the wall. But it doesn't come through the wall like we make it somewhere. It's not just completely matched, right? So yes, that's why it falls apart. You have to import energy so that the entity can know about the system and move it, and all of that has an associated entropy cost. So the entropy still goes up because it's and it's also an open system. Good. Good thinking, student. Good job.
I recently heard some people discussing AI, and they were actually suggesting that the rise of AI will make people like Maxwell obsolete. I was wondering if you could maybe discuss that a little.
Not an expert on AI, but I'll say this generally about machines. Machines can repeat things, but they normally have to be designed to do something. They always have to be designed to do something. They always have to be designed to do something. And then they also have to have inputs. And so where do these inputs arise from? So even like AI models that train, they're gathering things from the internet, gathering things from the literature. It's still, you have to have, and humans wrote those things, right? So it's gathering something together. So could it overcome a Maxwell? It probably could overcome, you have, we've had for some time devices in our pockets that can do arithmetic better than we can. And so there'll be other things like Wolfram, oh no, I'd let the cat out of the bag. Students. Wolfram Alpha can already do all of your geometry, your calculus. It can solve your PDs. Engineers were doing it. Okay, they already know about it. So there you go. Right? They know about it, right? So all that math can be done. When I had my moment of alarm, I put in my dissertation work, and I was like, can you tell me that, or stuff that I had thought about that I didn't get to in my dissertation work, and it couldn't do that. Will it do that with time? I don't see it. It's speculative, though. Generally, we are importing, so if you want to take an information theory angle, we are importing information, we are importing design. And I think it's probably a safe principle to say that even for created things, the creator is always going to have a hand over the creation. Now, what may happen is the engineers that designed it and their patrons, their very wealthy patrons, will have more power and information over us. But I think for that tier of individual, there's going to be some leverage help. But this is where you get into Lewis, those people are just going to be more powerful than the rest of us. It's a man over dominating man issue. Thoughts? I'm no expert in AI, so the floor is open if anyone wants to talk about AI.
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on AI. I'm not an expert on but it does make me wonder, if there are these amazing computational machines that can do the calculations and computations so much faster, so much better than we can. I'm wondering if that actually opens up the possibility for more Faradays, right? Who don't need to do the computation themselves. They can puzzle, they can postulate, they can experiment, and they can have the machines do the crunching, but they don't necessarily need to be able to do the crunching themselves. I don't know. What do you think about that?
So, imagine someone puts in there, let's say we don't have a theory of electromagnetism. I don't know how you'd have these machines without it. Just bear with me. We have one of Maxwell's questions, and we say, can you give me a model, a mechanically based model of a field that describes these phenomena of electricity and magnetism that covers induction? Okay. So think about all that you just imported into the machine. All of those words mean something. All of those words together mean something that were in your mind. Telling a machine, do this thing and tell me about a field and the force interactions, there is so much informational content in those words themselves that I think we underestimate the power of the human mind and even bringing that together and asking it to do that. So it's even a super task saying, bring these two things together, and it may be able to do it faster. Like Maxwell, that's the other thing he was teaching. He made algebraic slips on the whiteboard. So, right. So it had an issue with several of his proofs that he had to correct, especially with the gas theory. So you could say, write a statistically based theory of gas molecules using this equation and this equation, and the proof's done with no need for corrections, right? So the editing process gets streamlined. But that question, can you take statistics and do this? I don't. That's a human import that you have to ask the machine to do, and in a sense that actually should increase our humanism in a good sense, in the religious sense of appreciating our image bearing, because we ask such questions like, why would a machine ask that? So,
should I comment on it?
Please.
Nice. Okay.
This is a forum.
Yeah, AI has no concept of field, right? It's still just a bunch of words and probabilities to add up to what we have told it field might be. It's never going to have any of those imaginative qualities, and it will never be able to actually differentiate between essential and accidental qualities, right? Again, it's just more probabilities, but it doesn't ever understand anything. And so that's a pretty big difference, because at the end of the day, Maxwell actually gets to know things. But more importantly, like we've talked about a lot, he gets to know his creator, right? One of the most fascinating things you talk to all of us, not just me, you talk to you guys too. One of the most fascinating things you talked about was this idea of unity between electricity and magnetism and light. And how cool is that? Those things seem so separate, right? But it shows this imaginative creation of God that we get to interact with these different things. And the AI never gets to appreciate that. No matter how creative, quote, end quote, the AI becomes, it's never going to like worship the creator, right? It's never going to accomplish the chief end and glorify God, right?
Well, that is a great place to end. Makes me think of Augustine's Confessions. Right? Man desires to praise thee. AI does not. So if you're enjoying these Collegium lecture nights, we have many more to come. Be on the lookout for those things. We have one on December 5th at Parish Presbyterian Church. Dr. Matt Vest from Ohio State is going to come and talk about bioethics, anthropology, and the classical tradition. So you don't want to miss that. That's 6:30, December 5th at Parish Presbyterian. But join me again in thanking Dr. Johnson for his talk tonight.
Thank you, guys.
So continue to the party, talk about all the demons and hypothetical scenarios with AI downstairs, with the reception, and with Dr. Johnson. Thank you all so much for coming out.